Odessa Marchand had been counting the same 4 coins in her coat pocket for the better part of 10 minutes when the officer told her to get up. "Ma'am, you can't sit here all morning. I bought a coffee," Odessa said, nodding toward the paper cup sweating on the table in front of her. "I'm allowed to sit where I bought a coffee." The officer, young, blonde, badge-reading R. Kessler, looked at her the way people looked at a stain on a carpet they hadn't noticed before and now couldn't stop seeing. "There's been complaints about loitering at this counter. You've been here since 6. I get off my shift at 6. I come here before the buses start running good. I've been coming to this diner for 13 years, son." "I'm not your son." Behind the counter, the diner's owner, Patsy Doiron, busied herself wiping down a grill that didn't need wiping, the way people do when they want very badly not to be looking at something. 2 booths over, a man in a gray wool coat lowered his newspaper an inch, watching over the top of it the way a man watches a hockey game he isn't sure he wants to admit he's invested in. What none of them knew, not Officer Kessler, not Patsy with her grill rag, not the man in the wool coat, was that the woman they were about to humiliate in a diner on the corner of King and Sherbourne had spent 31 years opening this city's municipal offices at 5 in the morning, filing the paperwork nobody else wanted to file, and raising 3 children alone on a payroll clerk's salary after her husband's heart gave out in a Canadian Tire parking lot. And what Odessa Marchand didn't know, sitting there with her 4 coins and her cooling coffee, was that the quiet man behind the newspaper was about to become the reason her name ended up in the newspaper too, though not in the way either of them could have guessed that cold Tuesday in November. If you're watching this from somewhere cold this morning, drop a comment and tell us where, and stick around, because what happens to Odessa Marchand by the end of this story is going to make you want to call somebody you love. Odessa's apartment was the upper half of a duplex on Bartlett Avenue that her late husband Reuben had bought in 1986, back when that stretch of the city was still considered the wrong side of the tracks and the mortgage payments were small enough that a man working at the rail yard and a woman doing data entry for the city could actually manage them. 38 years later, the neighborhood had filled in with coffee shops that sold $7 lattes and condo towers going up 2 blocks over, and the mortgage was long paid off. But the property taxes had tripled in a decade, and the furnace was older than her youngest grandchild. She woke at 4:40 most mornings out of habit more than necessity now, since she'd retired from the city's payroll office 18 months ago after they'd right-sized her department and offered her a package that was, in the way of such things, generous enough to make refusing it look ungrateful and small enough to make accepting it feel like a small death. 31 years of getting other people's paychecks right down to the cent, and in the end she'd been let go by a spreadsheet. She still got up early because her grandson Marcus needed someone to get him out the door for school. Her daughter Yolanda worked nights at the hospital, and her son-in-law drove long haul, gone Sunday night to Friday most weeks. So it had fallen to Odessa, the way things tend to fall to grandmother, to be the one standing in the kitchen at 6:45, making sure a 9-year-old boy had eaten something other than dry cereal before he caught the bus. This particular morning, before Marcus's alarm, before the school bus, Odessa had 2 things she needed to do, and she did them the way she did most things, quietly, on a budget, without asking anyone for help. The first was the envelope she left in old Mr. Babineau's mailbox 3 doors down. He was 91 and had outlived his wife by 6 years, and his pension didn't quite stretch to cover both his heart medication and his hydro bill some months, and Odessa had worked out, without ever saying a word to him about it. That $20 slipped into an unmarked envelope on the 1st of the month meant he never had to choose. She'd done it for 2 years. He probably suspected it was her. There weren't exactly a lot of mysterious benefactors on Bartlett Avenue, but neither of them had ever said so, and that suited them both fine. The second thing was the letter sitting on her kitchen table, which she had now read so many times the creases were starting to tear. Notice of tax arrears, 14 Bartlett Avenue, the letter explained, in the particular bloodless language that governments use when they are about to take something from you, that the property had fallen behind on its municipal tax assessment by a sum that had ballooned, with penalties and interest, to just over $11,000, a figure that made no sense to Odessa at all, because she had set up automatic payments through the city's portal herself, the same portal she used to administer for other people for 3 decades. She'd called the tax office twice. Both times she'd been told there was no record of a payment plan on file, that the account showed as delinquent going back 14 months, and that if the balance wasn't settled by the end of the month, the file would be referred to the city's tax sale process. 14 months. That was around the same time Whitcomb Realty Partners had started buying up half the street. She hadn't said that out loud to anyone yet. It sounded, even in her own head, like the kind of thing a person says when they're looking for someone to blame. And Odessa Marchand had not survived 63 years as a black woman in this city by being the kind of person who went around making accusations she couldn't prove. But she'd noticed the for sale signs go up on the Halloran place and the Iqbal place, and the little blue house on the corner that used to belong to a retired schoolteacher who'd lived there since before Odessa was born. And every single one of those houses, within a year of selling, had a Whitcomb Realty sign hammered into a fresh strip of sod and a building permit posted in the window for something with the words luxury or boutique in the description. She folded the letter back along its tired creases, tucked it under the sugar bowl where Marcus wouldn't see it, and asked questions she didn't have good answers for, and went to wake her grandson up for school. By the time she walked him to the corner to catch the 7:15 bus, checked that his mitts were actually on his hands and not just stuffed in his backpack the way 9-year-olds like to do, and made her way to Patsy's Diner for the one indulgence she allowed herself most mornings, a coffee, black, with the $2 and change she kept separate from everything else in a little tin marked, in her own handwriting from 20 years ago, Odessa's coffee money. The morning had already cost her more than it should have, and she had no idea it was about to cost her a great deal more. The man in the gray wool coat in the corner booth had a name, though nobody at Patsy's that morning knew it. Lieutenant Colonel Malik Dawson, retired, 11 years out of the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 tours overseas, a knee that ached when the weather turned the way it had turned that week, and a habit, one he was not entirely proud of sitting in diners early in the morning because the silence of his own apartment had become a thing he needed to escape from on a regular basis. He hadn't planned on saying anything. He'd told himself, watching Officer Kessler loom over the older woman's table with his hand resting near his belt, in that particular way young cops sometimes did when they wanted you to notice it was there, that it wasn't his business. He'd told himself that for almost 90 full seconds, which was longer than it sounds. It was the second officer who changed his mind. The first one's partner, a heavier man with a buzz cut and a name tag reading T. Peak, came over from where he'd been standing by the door and put his hand flat against the older woman's shoulder, not violently exactly, but with enough weight behind it that her coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup. "She's not moving fast enough for you, Kessler," Pike said, like it was a joke between them. "Maybe she needs help finding the door." "I am moving," Odessa said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very even in the particular way that, if you knew her, if you were her daughter, or her late husband, or anyone who'd worked under her in the payroll office and seen her correct a city councillor's expense report without raising her voice once, you would have recognized as the most dangerous tone Odessa Marchand owned. "I am getting my coat. I would appreciate you taking your hand off me while I do it." Pike's hand didn't move. Malik Dawson stood up. He didn't say anything dramatic. There was no shouted, "Leave her alone" of the kind a director might have written into the scene. He simply stood, set $2 on his table for a coffee he hadn't finished, and walked over and said, in the low-level voice of a man who had given orders to soldiers under fire and had never once needed to raise it, "Take your hand off her shoulder." Pike turned, took in the gray coat, the close-cropped gray hair, the stillness of a man who was not afraid and was not pretending not to be afraid, which are two very different things. "This isn't your business, sir. I'm making it my business. Take your hand off her shoulder." What neither officer knew, what nobody in Patsy's Diner that morning knew, including the woman whose shoulder was currently pinned under Constable Pike's hand, was that the quiet man in the gray coat had once commanded a battalion, and that the woman they were manhandling out of a diner over a $4 coffee had 18 months earlier been the person responsible for making sure every single municipal employee in this city, including, as it happened, The police force's civilian payroll got paid correctly and on time for 3 decades without a single complaint on file. Neither one of them had any idea the other existed before that morning. By the end of the year, neither one of them would be able to imagine their life without the other in it. Pike took his hand off her shoulder. Not because Malik Dawson said please, because something in the way he said it made it clear that the alternative to complying wasn't an argument, and Pike, for all his bluster, was the kind of man who only pushed when he was fairly sure nobody was going to push back. "You want to watch yourself," Kessler said to Malik, trying to recover some authority that had quietly leaked out of the room. "We're conducting police business. You're harassing a senior citizen over a coffee," Malik said. "I served this country for 22 years so people like her could sit in a diner in peace. I'd be very interested to hear how you'd explain this stop to your sergeant." There was a silence that went on a beat too long. Then Kessler muttered something about a follow-up report, and the two officers left, the bell over the door jangling behind them with a cheerfulness that felt, in that moment, entirely out of place. Patsy came around the counter with a fresh coffee, on the house, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. "Odessa, honey, I am so sorry. I didn't know what to do. It's all right, Patsy." Odessa's voice was steady, though her hands folded in her lap were not. She looked up at the man in the gray coat, really looked at him for the first time. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Malik said simply, and sat down across from her without asking, the way you do when you have decided a conversation isn't finished yet. "Lieutenant Colonel Malik Dawson, retired Odessa Marchand," she said. "Also retired, though it didn't feel like my choice the way it sounds like yours probably was." Something in the dry, exact way she said it made him almost smile. "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." They sat there for the better part of an hour, two strangers with nowhere urgent to be, and by the time Odessa finally stood up to go meet Marcus at the bus stop after school let out, she had told a man she'd known for 60 minutes more about the tax letter under her sugar bowl than she'd told her own daughter. What Odessa didn't yet understand, what it would take 3 more weeks, a city council hearing, and a great deal of digging by a man with a military pension and far too much free time on his hands to uncover, was that her tax account hadn't fallen delinquent because of any error she'd made. Someone inside the city's assessment office had quietly flagged a cluster of properties on Bartlett Avenue and 3 adjoining streets for administrative review, a process that on paper sounded routine and in practice meant payment records mysteriously stopped being applied, automatic withdrawals silently failed without notification, and homeowners, disproportionately older, disproportionately working class, disproportionately the kind of people without a lawyer on retainer, found themselves, 14 months later, staring down tax sale notices on properties they'd owned for decades. Every single flagged property sat inside the exact boundary of a rezoning application filed by Whitcomb Realty Partners. It was Malik who found that first thread. He'd shown up at Patsy's the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, ostensibly for the coffee, and somewhere in the 3rd week of these accidental on-purpose mornings, Odessa had finally told him the whole of it. The for sale signs, the demolition permits, the eerie coincidence of which houses on Bartlett Avenue had suddenly developed tax problems and which hadn't. "You worked payroll for the city," Malik said slowly. "Did you ever work alongside the assessment office? Would you know how their record system is structured?" "I know how every department's record system is structured," Odessa said, with the particular flat pride of a woman who had spent 31 years being the only person in a building who actually understood how the building worked. "I trained half of them on it myself." "Then I think," Malik said, "you should request your own file." It took her 3 formal requests, 2 of which the city's clerk office simply ignored, before a young records officer named Priya Sandhu, who it would later turn out had her own reasons to be uneasy about what she was finding in those files, finally pulled the actual transaction log on Odessa's account and discovered something that should not have been possible. A payment plan that had been active and current for 14 months, manually deactivated by an administrative override 2 days after the rezoning application for the 14 Bartlett Avenue parcel had been quietly logged with the city's planning department under a name that wasn't Odessa's. Someone had submitted paperwork to rezone Odessa Marchand's own house out from under her, before her tax file had even gone delinquent. When Odessa understood what she was looking at, sitting in Priya Sandhu's small gray office, with the printout trembling slightly in her hands, she didn't cry, though her eyes burned the way they had the day she buried her husband. What she felt instead was something colder and clearer, the particular fury of a woman who has spent 31 years being scrupulously, meticulously correct, and discovers that the system she gave her working life to has decided her correctness doesn't matter when it's inconvenient. "I want to know who signed off on this," she said. The signature on the override belonged to a deputy director in the assessment office named Garrett Voss. The rezoning application had been filed by a numbered company that traced back through 3 shell layers Priya had no business being able to find and found anyway to Whitcomb Realty Partners, and the campaign donations that Whitcomb Realty Partners had made over the previous 2 municipal election cycles traced, with uncomfortable consistency, to a city councillor named Theodore Marsh. The same councillor who chaired the planning committee that would ultimately vote on the rezoning of 3 entire blocks, including Bartlett Avenue, into what the application politely called a mixed-use revitalization corridor. It would have stayed buried, the way these things usually do, if Odessa Marchand had simply paid the $11,000 she didn't owe and let the house go to a tax sale. That was, everyone involved would later admit, the expected outcome. Older woman, on a fixed income, with no lawyer and no leverage, facing a deadline and a bureaucracy designed to be exhausting rather than navigable. The math was supposed to work out in Whitcomb's favor, the same way it had worked out on the Halloran Place and the Iqbal Place and the little blue house on the corner. What nobody had accounted for was Malik Dawson's stubbornness, or Priya Sandhu's conscience, or the simple fact that Odessa Marchand had spent 31 years learning exactly how the city's paperwork worked and was not, under any circumstances, going to be out-bureaucrated by a 34-year-old deputy director with a numbered company and a councillor on retainer. The city council hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early December, in a municipal chambers room that smelled of old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. Odessa had asked to speak during the public comment period on the proposed Bartlett Avenue rezoning, a request the clerk's office had tried, twice, to lose in its own paperwork, an irony that was not lost on her. She wore the navy blue suit she'd bought for Reuben's funeral 14 years earlier, the only suit she owned that still fit the way she wanted a suit to fit when she was about to stand in front of a room full of people who'd spent their careers deciding that women like her didn't need to be listened to too carefully. The chambers were fuller than usual. Word had gotten around, partly through Patsy, who had told every customer who came through her diner for 2 weeks straight, partly through Priya Sandhu, who'd quietly reached out to a reporter at the local paper after deciding her conscience mattered more than her job security, and partly through Malik Dawson, who had spent his considerable retirement savings of patience calling every veterans organization, every seniors advocacy group, and every community association he had a contact in, until the room held perhaps 60 people who had no formal stake in Bartlett Avenue at all, but had decided to show up anyway. Councillor Theodore Marsh chaired the meeting with the practiced boredom of a man who did not expect to be challenged. He called Odessa Marchand's name without looking up from his papers. She stood, walked to the podium, and set down a single folder. "My name is Odessa Marchand," she said, and her voice, which had wavered slightly in the elevator on the way up, did not waver now. "I have lived at 14 Bartlett Avenue for 38 years. I worked for this city's payroll office for 31 of them, processing the paychecks of nearly every person in this room, including Councillor Marsh, your own staff, between 2009 and 2014. A ripple went through the room. Marsh's eyes came up from his papers for the first time. 14 months ago, Odessa continued, my property tax account, which had been in good standing on an automatic payment plan for 2 years, was manually flagged and deactivated by a deputy director in your assessment office. 2 days after a rezoning application was quietly filed for my property and the properties of 11 of my neighbors under a numbered company that traces back to Whitcomb Realty Partners, a company that has made $18,000 in campaign contributions to your office over the last 2 election cycles. The murmur in the room had turned into something closer to a held breath. I am not a lawyer. I am not an accountant. Though I did teach half your assessment office how to use the record system they apparently use to erase my payment history. I am a 63-year-old retired city employee who very nearly lost the only home she's ever owned, the home her late husband worked nights at the rail yard to pay for, because somebody in this building decided my street was worth more to them empty than it was with people living on it. I have brought documentation tonight that I will be submitting to this council, to the city's integrity commissioner, and to the reporters sitting in the third row, showing exactly how that happened, and to whom. She set the folder down on the podium and stepped back, and for one long moment nobody in the chambers said a single word. It was Marlene. No, Odessa caught herself. That wasn't the name. There was no Marlene in this story at all, only the elderly woman 2 rows back, a stranger to her until that very night, who stood up first, leaning on her cane and began to clap, and then the woman beside her stood, and then a man near the back who turned out to be the retired schoolteacher who'd sold the little blue house on the corner and had been quietly grieving the loss of it ever since, certain he'd simply made a foolish decision in his old age, and never once suspecting he'd been pushed. And then the whole room was standing, and Councillor Theodore Marsh sat very still at the head of the table, the color draining slowly out of his face, while Malik Dawson stood near the back wall in his gray wool coat, not clapping, just watching her with an expression that, had Odessa turned around to see it, she would not have needed any further explanation of. The investigation that followed moved faster than anyone expected, the way these things sometimes do, once enough light gets showing on them at once. The city's integrity commissioner opened a formal review within the week. Garrett Voss was placed on administrative leave within 10 days, and under the threat of a forensic audit, admitted within a month that he'd manually altered 11 property files at the direct request of a Whitcomb Realty executive, in exchange for what he initially described, with breathtaking specificity, as a finder's fee, and what investigators later determined, after subpoenaing his bank records, had actually amounted to just over $40,000 across 18 months. Councillor Theodore Marsh did not survive the news cycle that followed. He announced, 3 weeks before the by-election he would otherwise have faced, that he would not be seeking re-election, citing, without any apparent sense of irony, a desire to spend more time focusing on community service. Whitcomb Realty Partners' rezoning application was withdrawn before the planning committee ever got the chance to vote on it. The numbered company dissolved itself 2 months later, the way such companies are designed to do when the people behind them sense the ground shifting. Officer Kessler and Constable Pike were never criminally charged. There was, in the end, no law against being rude to an old woman in a diner, however much everyone involved wished there were. But the diner footage Patsy had quietly preserved on her security system found its way into the Regional Police Board's review of the precinct's conduct complaints, and both men were transferred out of the downtown division within the year, which was, Odessa told Malik over coffee one Tuesday morning, not justice exactly, but I'll take it. The Halloran place and the Iqbal place were never recovered. Those families had already sold, already moved on, already absorbed the loss in the particular quiet way that people without resources are forced to absorb loss, without lawyers or city council hearings, or a retired lieutenant colonel willing to spend his pension on phone calls. It was the one part of the story that never fully resolved, the part Odessa carried with her afterward, a reminder that for every Bartlett Avenue that got saved, there were streets across the city that hadn't been, and probably never would be. But Odessa kept her house. The $11,000 in arrears were wiped from her file entirely, with a formal written apology from the city that she kept framed in a drawer rather than on a wall, because she said she didn't need to look at an apology to know it was overdue. A year later, almost to the week, Odessa Marchand walked through the front doors of a renovated building on Sherbourne Street that had once housed a failed furniture warehouse and now held the offices of the Bartlett Avenue Community Trust, a tenant and homeowner cooperative she had helped found with seed funding that had come. In a final twist, neither she nor anyone else in the diner that November morning could ever have predicted, from Malik Dawson himself, who had quietly liquidated a portion of his military pension fund and a small inheritance he'd never known what to do with, and asked for nothing in return except a desk near the window and the title of volunteer, which was, everyone who worked there understood, a significant understatement of what he actually did. The trust now provided legal aid to homeowners facing tax disputes, ran a seniors advocacy clinic 2 days a week, and had, in its first year, stopped 4 other quietly manipulated tax arrears cases in 3 different neighborhoods before they ever reached a sale notice. Priya Sandhu, who had been quietly let go from the assessment office 6 weeks after she'd pulled Odessa's file, a dismissal everyone understood for exactly what it was, now ran the trust's records department, having decided that doing the right thing once had cost her a job she'd liked and that doing it full-time was, on balance, a better trade than she'd expected. Mrs. Babineau's daughter called, Priya said, setting a folder on Odessa's desk. She wants to know if we can look at her father's property assessment. Same neighborhood, similar pattern. Tell her yes, Odessa said. Tell her we'll have someone out there by Friday. At noon, Odessa walked the 2 blocks to Patsy's Diner, which had survived the upheaval of the past year rather better than expected. Patsy had become something of a minor local celebrity for the security footage, and business had, if anything, improved. The same booth by the window was empty, the way it usually was around that hour, and Malik was already there, 2 coffees on the table, the way he'd taken to ordering for both of them without asking, which, Odessa had decided, after a year, she didn't entirely mind. Marcus made the honor roll, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Yolanda's framing the certificate ready. You'd think the boy discovered penicillin. He's a good kid, Malik said. He came by the office Saturday and helped Priya reorganize the filing cabinets. Didn't complain once. That's because you bribed him with hot chocolate. That's between me and the boy. Through the window, Odessa watched the street outside, the same street where, a year and some months ago, an elderly man's mailbox had quietly received an unmarked envelope on the 1st of every month, where a tax notice had nearly cost a woman the only thing her late husband had ever managed to leave her, where a stranger in a gray coat had stood up over a $4 coffee for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. The for sale signs were gone now. In their place, new ones had gone up along the block. Community Land Trust, Protected Tenancy, small and unglamorous and, to Odessa Marchand, more beautiful than any condo rendering Whitcomb Realty Partners had ever printed. She thought, watching the street, about how close she'd come to simply paying a bill she didn't owe and disappearing quietly the way the system had wanted her to. She thought about dignity and how it wasn't something other people handed you. The way the city had tried to hand her an apology she didn't need framed. It was something you held on to yourself, in the small unmarked envelopes, in the mended backpacks, in the standing up over a coffee cup when nobody asked you to. Marcus would be out of school in an hour. She'd be there to meet him at the bus stop, the way she always was, and tomorrow morning she'd be up before the sun again, not because anyone needed her to be anymore, but because some habits, once they've kept you alive long enough, become the thing worth living for.